year's theme is 2020 Spiritual Vision. Our theme for August is Inclusion in Action. This month is about fully embracing ourselves as a spiritual community that celebrates diversity, fosters inclusion, champions inner work, and creates space for brave, vulnerable conversation. And today's topic is, who are we? Ernest Holmes wrote, unity does not mean uniformity. This idea of the oneness of God is we find ourselves immersed in a universality, each one a unique individual and different manifestation of that which itself is one, undivided, indivisible, and whole. Thomas Merton wrote, the beginning of love is the will to let those we love be perfectly themselves, the resolution not to twist them to fit our own image. If in loving them we do not love what they are, but only their potential likeness to ourselves, then we do not love them. We only love the reflection of ourselves we find in them. Let's speak and know this truth together. I love well. I see the holiness in all life. I understand that oneness is not sameness. Therefore, I celebrate our uniqueness and diversity. I advocate for inclusion. I stand for dignity and human rights of all. I love well. And now, back to Reverend Kathleen.
Who are we? There is great value in getting clear about our identities, whether they're individual identities or identities of the whole or the collective, and what we're bringing to the table. Because truly valuing who we are, truly valuing who others are, is the pathway of inclusion. Can you see it? I mean, it's really clear to me. That's where it comes down to. And that last quote that Kelly just read says it so beautifully. It means valuing each other as we are, not as we hope the other person would be, but valuing each other as we are. The byproduct, the gift that comes from that is inclusion. And this month is all about inclusion in action. So who are we? Let's go back to that question. We know from our teachings and from our own deep inner work, our own deep inner contemplative natures, that we are unique individualizations of the one source. And we're incarnated in these human bodies for a period of time, and yet the essence of who we are is eternal. And as spirit beings, we inherit unlimited potentiality and possibility because we are of the one universal mind. We're interconnected with it. Everything that comes through us is sourced from that one presence. And so therefore we have within us amazing capacities and talents and gifts. And so you couple that with our life experiences and with our identities, our own ways that we show up in these human bodies. And that makes for some really amazing beings who are capable of doing amazing things. Let that sink in. That's who we are. That's our true identity, made in the likeness and image of God. That part has got to be so clear as a starting point for us as we move through life, because this is the true key to the full expression of our divinity. And at the same time, we're also very unique and so on, but we're also one. And it's kind of one of those mind-blowing paradoxes. We're also one. We're unified in one field of consciousness. And we share, we're one in a shared planet and cosmos. And we are one, of course, in the shared source. So we're all interrelated, we're all interconnected, we often hear we're all brothers and sisters, despite who our biological mothers and fathers are, because our connection is beyond this visible world. Our invisible nature, the spirit essence of who we are, is connected with each other and with everyone and everything else. So this month, where we focus on where the rubber meets the road, putting inclusion into action, we are naturally wanting to therefore more fully embody this thing called oneness consciousness, which, and love, all-inclusive love, goes hand in hand with it. Yet, we have grown up immersed in a culture whose history is one of separation. A separation based on like a hierarchy, or an artificial, and it's artificial, an artificial dyad of superiority and inferiority, kind of a pecking order. Bias is what it's called. And it's made up by the human mind, usually for economic gain or some other type of gain, and then gets passed down through the generations. So here's the thing, and this is the great, not only the great hope, but the great joy, is that what the human mind has made up, truth can so easily dismantle. And so our own human individualization can dismantle it. And we have the spiritual tools to do this. And so it's the intention then is to remove, dismantle the dyad of superiority, inferiority, the biases that are part of this culture in which we live, and we're immersed in it, let's face it. So it's up to us then to do our part in its dismantling. And believe me, it's way more powerful. It's not just little old me doing the dismantling. It is the grand divine presence that you and I are doing this dismantling, raising the frequency and the vibration on the planet, which affects everyone because we are interconnected. And we aren't the only ones doing this work. It's not just our community. It's all of the communities and centers for spiritual living. And I know so many other light workers and other people across the planet are doing this work as well. So what happens then is when we remove the biases, we call it the story sometimes, the story, the human made-up story of how things are, this whole dyad, the biases, when we remove that, what's remaining? The real, genuine, authentic self. That authentic self then shines through. So our nature, because of the kind of beings that we are, is to see as God sees. That means seeing through the eyes and with the eyes of all-inclusive love. So our journey then, I'm just going to revisit this, our journey is 100% ultimately about elimination. Elimination of all that does not belong to our God natures. And I am so grateful that built into each and every one of us is this evolutionary urge, this urge to grow and expand and unfold our divinity. It's in there. We can feel it at times. Sometimes it feels like we're unsettled, or we have a vision of something greater, some greater possibility. But that's the divine urge that's built into us. And that vision that we catch is a vision that pulls us forward into greater expression. it's about letting go of all the stuff that gets in the way of that in consciousness. I think Howard Thurman says this so well, and if you haven't read anything by Howard Thurman, I'll highly recommend it. I spent a whole month on one of his books within the past year. He says there is something in every one of you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in yourself. It is the only true guide you will ever have. And if you cannot hear it, you will, all your life, spend your days on the strings that somebody else pulls. Whoa, that's powerful. So it really behooves us to tap into that genuine nature, to clear away everything that does not belong, so that we are guided from within. We are not pulled by the strings of things that happen to show up on the media or whatever else. We learn to tap in and listen within, and that's our guiding principle, which will always steer us in the right direction because it's our God nature. So let's get to work then, okay? Let's get to work at seeing ourselves more clearly. Let's get to work at the dismantling of this thing that's called learned bias. Yes, something made up by the human mind. We weren't born with it. So bias, just a little bit more about bias. Bias comes from the belief that one thing, one trait, one group, or some particular person is superior or inferior to another. There's that same dyad of superiority, inferiority. It's made up. I think it's really important that we get that. It's made up by the human mind. We know that in truth, we all have value. We all are equally valuable and amazing beings. And so it's about getting all of the other stuff that tells us otherwise out of the way. So this tendency, this thing called bias, this tendency to judge and compare results in something that psychologists call internalized oppression. Internalized oppression. And this is what it looks like. An Alaskan Native woman who looks down on her other Native people from the village and teases them for their village accent. This can happen within our own communities, not just between different cultures. Internalized oppression also is shown in this example. A man in the Philippines spending his hard-earned money to pay for treatments in a skin whitening clinic. A mother in the United Kingdom, while playing catch with her daughter, tells her, "Don't throw like a girl." A Mexican-American adolescent who is embarrassed of his parents as they struggle to talk with the teacher in their limited, broken, and accented English. Internalized oppression, it shows up not only in the way we treat others, but in the way we treat ourselves, that negative self-talk. That's internalized oppression. And it comes from that same dyad of this is better than this, superiority, inferiority. When we buy into these messages that we hear in our culture, we almost unconsciously begin to see certain traits or being a member of a particular group or even being who we are as not desirable. This is really powerful stuff to confront because it makes all the difference in the world when we can face it and see it for what it is and tell ourselves that this is not the truth. So internalized oppression then invisibly guides our behavior when we don't deal with it in destructive ways. It's destructive for our own self-images, and and well-being. It's destructive in our families. It's destructive in our cultures. And it's destructive in our communities and the world as a whole. It truly affects us all because we are all interconnected. Nobody is truly left out. Even those who think they're superior ultimately suffer from this kind of thinking. So believing that women, people of other races, LGBT folks, people with disabilities are inferior is made up. It is made up by the human mind. But it has an impact, even though it's made up, it has an impact because it distorts our views of ourselves and others. And it leads to things like emotional abuse, substance abuse, violence, and hate crimes. So now we know the source of it all. We really get what the source of it all is, this dyad, or bias that we call this dyad of superiority, inferiority, which is made up by the human mind. And so now for the solution, right? It's like, okay, let's get on with the solution. We get it. Ernest Holmes put it so beautifully in The Science of Mind textbook on page 423. He said, what the world needs is spiritual conviction followed by spiritual experience. I would rather see a student of these teachings prove its principle than to have him or her repeat all the words of wisdom that have ever been uttered. It is far easier to teach the truth than it is to practice it. So practice, putting it into practice in our lives is what I'm calling for. So it's easy to say, oh yeah, I know what that is, and I know what causes it. But then the next piece, which I'm really calling upon each and every one of you to engage in, is the inner practice of the dismantling of all of these biases that have been conditioned in us, to do it with compassion, realizing we have been immersed in this. It's been in our subconscious mind since we were kids for most of us. So the practice is to watch and witness and observe the patterns of thought and the things that come out of our mouths and our behaviors that are in any way judging of ourselves and others, condemning of ourselves and others, that's based on a bias or a stereotype. And we will know that because it will not feel very good. When we have a kind of not very good feeling within us, we're either judging ourselves or judging others, most likely. It's that dyad in action within us. And before we go any farther, I want to distinguish between bias and preference and discernment, because this is really important. Bias comes from prejudice, and it's destructive. It comes from stereotypes and from this hierarchy that I'm talking about. Preference or discernment is making a decision that is constructive. So yes, it's still important that we're able to discern and make decisions. It's part of being human. So we're not talking about that today. We're talking about biases that are destructive. And these biases are driven by fear, ultimately, because love leads the way in things like discernment. Love leads the way. That's the difference. And our biases are sometimes apparent to us, but quite often they're subconscious. They're just out of our awareness, or maybe completely out of our awareness. And that's why meditation is so important. And that's why developing a witness consciousness, which we call mindfulness, is so important. And then I'm going to recommend a really powerful tool that I find has really supported me, and that's Byron Katie's wonderful tool, and it's a great tool for dismantling bias, believe me. And it's her Judge Your Neighbor worksheet. And she invites you to put all the judgments that you have about your neighbor, that means whoever you're upset with at the moment, and you can even do that on yourself, that you write it down, and then when you get it all down, you look at each and every statement and you ask yourself, is that true? Am I absolutely sure that that's true? Well, if I believe that's true, how am I living my life? What does my life look like, feel like, sound like? And I'd like to add to that, what is the impact I'm having on other people by believing that truth, believing that thought, believing that thought. And she said, any thought that gives you stress or is uncomfortable is not the truth. That's a great way to test to see if something's the truth or not. And then who would I be without this thought? If I were unburdened by this thought, who would I be? So that's where the uncovering of the genuine, authentic, divine nature takes place as we release those judging thoughts. And we can release them just simply by inquiry, by asking these questions. That's what's so powerful about this tool. So even if the rest of humanity has not come aboard yet on all-inclusive love, on their own work of dismantling that dyad of superiority and inferiority, if you do this work, you've freed yourself to be all you can be. You've freed yourself from the bias of others. So I'd like to illustrate that. This is a beautiful, beautiful story to illustrate how someone can free themselves from biases of others. I'm sure you've thought of many, many examples. An important speaker addressed the student body of a small college in South Carolina. The auditorium was filled with students excited about the opportunity to hear from a person of her stature speak. After the governor gave the introduction, the speaker moved to the microphone, looked at the audience from left to right, and began. I was born to a mother who was deaf and could not speak. I do not know who my father was, and I still don't. The first job I ever had was in a cotton field. The audience was spellbound. She continued. Nothing has to remain the way it is if it's not the way that we want it to be. She repeated it. Nothing has to remain the way it is if that's not the way we want it to be. She's standing in her colors and shades. And she goes on to say, it isn't luck, and it isn't circumstances. And it isn't being born a certain way that causes a person's future to become what it becomes. And softly she repeated, nothing has to remain the way that it is if that's not what we want it to be. She goes on to say, all we have to do is to change a situation that brings unhappiness and dissatisfaction is to answer this question. How do I want this situation to be? In other words, what is my vision? And then she says, then we must commit totally to personal actions that carry us there. Personal actions that carry us there. That's the inner work and moving into action that is being called for. A smile goes across her face, and she says, my name is Azy Taylor Morton. I stand before you as the treasurer of the United States of America. And for those of you who don't know who this is, Azy Taylor Morton served as the treasurer of the United States during the Carter administration from September 12, 1977 through January 20th, 1981. And she remains, as far as I know, at least this is the reference that I got, she remains the only African American to hold that office. Her signature was printed on the U.S. currency during her tenure. Such a prime example of somebody who knows who she is and who moves beyond stereotypes, beyond the biases, and becomes what she is inspired to become. If one person can do it, we can all do it. Yes? Yes. So we each can do our part in dismantling this dyad of superiority. The systems of racial inequality and other forms of inequality that we see in the structures of our society are coming to the surface, have come to the surface for us to heal. We can see it, there it is, and now we do the inner work. And the 21-day Racial Equity Challenge, this great work that our Social Justice Initiative Ministry is doing and encouraging us to participate in, is designed to do just that. As we educate ourselves about bias and its impact, and that education is a really important part. That's what the 21-day thing is all about, the 21-day process. It's an educational process so that we can look at the way things are, the condition. We do this when we get ready for doing a spiritual mind treatment. So we can do the inner work to dismantle the structures within us, within our culture. When we're doing our inner work, we're doing it for everyone, so that we can be part of the solution. So you can still join us. If you haven't started, that's okay. Show up today at 12 and be a part of the conversation. And I understand that Chrissy Gonzalez is going to be leading us, and that she is a very fine facilitator. I got word directly from Jen on that, and Virgie. So here's the thing that I want to share with you, particularly those of you who are fairly new to our community, is we have spent 10 years really building a certain atmosphere in our community. We've been focusing, you can see it in our intention statement we say every week. We also have a larger vision statement. And what we've created is a culture or an atmosphere of love. An atmosphere in which we can be mutually supportive in doing things like this work of dismantling biases. And so I know together we can do this. In some ways it's really easier in a group than it is on our own because we learn from each other. When we share our wisdom with each other, we learn so much. So here's the thing. If you are committed to moving from a world where the dyad of superiority, inferiority silently runs things in the world, to a paradigm of all-inclusive love, where all-inclusive love leads, then please type yes in the chat box. Do that now. Type yes in the chat box if you are committed to moving from a world that is run by this dyad of superiority to one that is led by all-inclusive love, oneness consciousness. Type yes. Thank you. So we've made our verbal commitment. So I'd like to leave you with this final story. And this is the story that really shows to me how powerful an impact we have on other people, particularly adults have on children. There once was a teacher who had a room full of new students. Their names were numbers such as 145, 155, 143, 141. She assumed the numbers were their IQs, and she was so excited because she had now had a room full of geniuses. So she treated them like geniuses throughout the year. She gave them challenging work, lots of praise and encouragement. And at the end of the year, the principal came into her room and asked how she did it. They all had A's, and they all did so well. She said, well, it's easy when you have a room full of smart kids who are geniuses. The principal says, geniuses? Those children were the most challenged kids that we had in the school. The teacher replies, but their IQs were by their names. I don't understand. And he says, IQs? Those were their locker numbers. So whether that story is true or not, we do know that our attitudes about others make a difference. And so the truth is that we are all geniuses. We are patterned after the grand genius of the universe, which is God. That's we're made in the likeness and image of that genius. So let's bravely explore our identities in all their complexity and splendor. Let's also kindly and boldly explore our subconscious biases that we know stand in the way of our authentic, genuine selves and a world that works for all. The work of coming to know and love the self, and the work of coming to be able to actually see people and love them for who they are, is an act of the divine. It is the work of seeing, knowing, and loving God everywhere, in everyone, and that includes ourselves. It is an act of being awake to the truth that the soul of the universe is our soul, that the genius of the universe is our genius. And let us remember the story of A.Z. Taylor Morton, who overcame all odds, and became the treasurer of the United States. Because we all have that within us. And also let us remember our impact on others with the story of the teacher who treated her students like geniuses. Let us together do amazing things. And so I'd like you to repeat after me this beautiful affirmation, just to really anchor it into our consciousness. I stand proud of who I am.
I stand proud of who I am.
I adore myself.
I adore myself,
And I give myself love freely.
and I give myself love freely.
I bravely heal my biases.
I bravely heal my biases
And embrace love
and embrace love
for all human beings
for all human beings
and all of life.
and all of life.
And yes!
Yes,
And so it is.
and so it is.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, now I'd